For nearly 2 years, much of Europe was reassured by a simple and comforting narrative about the Black Sea war zone, a version of events that made the conflict feel distant, contained, and almost routine. Viewers were told that the situation had stabilized, that front lines had hardened into place, and that time itself was quietly tilting in favor of the West. According to this storyline, the Black Sea had become a frozen arena, balanced and predictable, unlikely to generate sudden or disruptive change. That belief has now collapsed, not through a dramatic announcement or a headline-grabbing shock, but in a far more dangerous way, slowly and almost without notice. While public attention drifted to other crises, one of the central assumptions guiding Western strategy toward Ukraine failed completely. What followed was not a brief setback or a minor adjustment on the battlefield. It was a profound structural shift in maritime power, one with direct consequences for global trade routes, NATO's credibility, and Europe's long-term security architecture. Even now, this development is often dismissed as just another chapter in a long and exhausting war, but that reaction is a serious error. When major strategic changes go unrecognized, their effects do not disappear. They build, compound, and eventually reshape reality. The opening of what is now called the Odessa Corridor is not a matter of opinion or interpretation. It is a concrete fact, and without exaggeration, it represents the most significant strategic defeat the West has suffered in this conflict so far. Everything said about the Black Sea over the past 2 years must now be re-examined. The idea that this front was balanced, frozen, or locked in stalemate has been proven false. What we are witnessing is not a localized adjustment, but the collapse of a foundational belief that guided Western planning from the very beginning. Russia did not execute a simple battlefield maneuver. It carried out a long-range strategic operation aimed directly at the core of Ukraine's remaining economic and military strength. The opening of the Odessa Corridor is not about taking a single city or threatening an isolated port. It marks the start of a broader process designed to erode Ukraine's maritime sovereignty and, by extension, the credibility of the collective West. This was not an improvised reaction to changing conditions on the ground. It was the outcome of patient, sustained, and coherent planning over time. That is why this analysis avoids dramatic language or recycled slogans. The situation does not require theatrics. It demands a clear understanding of military logic, geography, and geopolitical reality. Russia has now established effective control over the maritime approaches to Odessa. By doing so, it created a navigation corridor under its own terms and pushed its operational reach deep into the western Black Sea. With this single move, the geometry of the conflict changed. The most important question is no longer how this happened, but why Odessa was always the real objective. Odessa is not just another Ukrainian city. It is the country's only truly viable deep-water port. Before the war, its facilities, together with nearby ports, handled most of Ukraine's exports, especially grain and steel. These are not symbolic commodities. Ukrainian grain feeds large parts of the global south, and Ukrainian steel supports industrial supply chains far beyond Eastern Europe. Control of the northwestern Black Sea therefore translates directly into control over Ukraine's economic circulation. With a corridor in place, Moscow gains not only military leverage, but also the ability to regulate, restrict, or permit food flows on a global scale. This shifts the conflict from a regional war into a tool of international pressure. The balance of power across the Black Sea basin has now changed. Pressure extends beyond Kyiv to NATO member states such as Romania and Bulgaria, and most importantly to Turkey, the guardian of the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. This reflects a classic strategy of strangulation, where control over narrow geographic choke points produces outsized political and economic influence. Signals inside NATO are increasingly hard to ignore. Emergency closed-door meetings, a noticeable shift in language from victory to stabilization, and growing unease in Washington and Brussels all point in the same direction. The alliance is confronting a military reality it underestimated for far too long. Russia has demonstrated that it still possesses the strategic depth required to concentrate power on decisive theater-level objectives. This operation was no accident. It was enabled by secured logistics, expanded air dominance, weakened Ukrainian naval capabilities, and the systematic exposure of vulnerabilities. Once again, geography was misread. NATO largely viewed Ukraine as a modern European state. Moscow viewed it as a southern security buffer, a perspective shaped by centuries of history. This move reveals exactly where the Kremlin is willing to concentrate power, where geography, economics, and military force intersect to create lasting influence. To understand why Odessa carries such weight in this equation, it is necessary to step back in time, because its importance did not begin in 2022, nor even in 1991. Its strategic value is far older, far deeper, and from Moscow's perspective, fundamentally non-negotiable. To understand why Russia was always likely to move in this direction, it is necessary to look back several centuries and examine the imperial logic that shaped the entire Black Sea region. From the late 18th century onward, after a series of decisive defeats inflicted on the Ottoman Empire, Russia began a systematic expansion southward under the rule of Catherine the Great. This drive was formalized through what became known as the Novorossiya Project. It was not a vague ambition or a symbolic vision, but a concrete geopolitical design intended to resolve one of Russia's most persistent strategic weaknesses, the lack of reliable access to warm water ports. In 1794, Odessa was deliberately founded as the southern gateway of the Russian Empire. For centuries, geography had constrained Russian economic and naval power. Northern ports froze for long periods, limiting trade, naval projection, and international influence. Odessa was created specifically to break that structural limitation. From its earliest days, the city was engineered to serve imperial interests. It quickly developed into one of the most important commercial centers in the Russian world and eventually became the empire's fourth largest city. It was cosmopolitan, economically dynamic, and strategically indispensable. Odessa's purpose was never ambiguous. It was meant to channel the agricultural output of the fertile southern steppes into global markets. Grain flowed outward, wealth flowed inward, and diplomatic influence followed. The city was never merely a commercial hub. It functioned as a naval anchor at the heart of Russian power in the Black Sea. Control of the coastline stretching from Crimea, annexed in 1783, to the Danube Delta was not an abstract aspiration, but a constant strategic objective. For more than 2 centuries, this logic shaped Russian military thinking. Every major conflict involving Russia, from the Napoleonic Wars to the Crimean War and through both world wars, was influenced by the same core concern: access, security, and maritime dominance. This long historical continuity exposes a fundamental Western misunderstanding of the current conflict. Russian leadership did not suddenly decide in 2022 that Odessa mattered. The objective was articulated openly from the earliest stages of the war. Senior Russian military figures spoke clearly about securing southern Ukraine and establishing a continuous land and maritime corridor, not only to link Crimea with occupied territories, but potentially to extend westward toward Transnistria, the pro-Russian region of Moldova. In Western discourse, this has often been framed as ideological expansionism. In reality, it reflects cold military logic. Control of the coastline means control of trade, protection of naval assets, and strategic depth against external pressure. Without that control, Crimea remains exposed. Its naval base, historically regarded as Russia's southern fortress, becomes vulnerable to interdiction and encirclement. For Moscow, that vulnerability is unacceptable. Western strategists struggle to interpret this reality because they operate on very different time horizons. Western politics is driven by election cycles, public messaging, and short-term crisis management. Moscow plans on historical scales. Where Western capitals saw a Ukrainian port that needed to remain operational, Russia saw an unresolved security flaw and a strategic gap that eventually had to be closed. The entire Black Sea security framework reflects this logic. The Montreux Convention of 1936, which governs naval passage through the Turkish Straits, exists precisely because control of the Black Sea is inseparable from control of territory and ports. Without durable influence over Odessa, Russia's naval position remains structurally constrained regardless of fleet size. As the war progressed, Western focus narrowed in ways that proved deeply consequential. Political, media, and military attention concentrated almost entirely on the Eastern Front. This narrowing of analysis shaped the later phases of the conflict. While international attention remained fixed on the Donbass, absorbing resources, political capital, and strategic messaging, the southern coastal theater evolved with far less scrutiny. This imbalance mattered. When Kherson fell, Odessa became Ukraine's primary economic lifeline. Yet NATO capitals continued to interpret the war largely as a land conflict centered in the east. That misjudgment would prove decisive. Ukraine committed many of its most experienced units to prolong attritional battles aimed at slowing Russian advances in the Donbass. That effort carried a hidden strategic cost. It gave Moscow the time and operational freedom needed to shape the southern coastal theater. The true center of gravity was never purely territorial. It was and remains the geoeconomic control of the Black Sea. This misunderstanding allowed Russia to methodically prepare the conditions necessary to open the Odessa Corridor. It was not a sudden maneuver or an opportunistic strike, but the result of sustained preparation rooted in history, geography, and a consistent strategic vision. The critical question that now emerges is how this corridor was actually opened and why Western defenses failed to prevent it. The answer to how the corridor was opened challenges many of the assumptions that dominated Western analysis from the start. There was no dramatic amphibious landing, no single decisive naval clash, and no sudden collapse of Ukrainian defenses. Despite years of predictions centered on a spectacular assault on Odessa, what unfolded was far more methodical and far more effective. Russia implemented a calculated strategy of strangulation designed to cripple the region's ability to function militarily and economically without ever needing to seize the city itself. This approach exposed structural weaknesses not only in Ukraine's defensive posture, but also in the way NATO chose to support it. The first and most decisive phase of this operation focused on logistics rather than territory. Moscow's objective was isolation, not occupation. The aim was to sever the arteries sustaining Odessa and what remained of Ukraine's naval presence in the Black Sea. To achieve this, Russia relied on persistent long-range strikes using precision weapons, including cruise missiles, glide bombs, and high-explosive munitions. These attacks were not symbolic or sporadic. They were systematic, sustained, and carefully sequenced. Critical infrastructure became the primary target set. Rail hubs, fuel depots, ammunition storage sites, and port logistics facilities were struck repeatedly with clear intent. Bridges and rail links connecting Odessa to the rest of Ukraine and to NATO's primary supply corridor through Romania were steadily degraded. The repeated strikes on the Zatoka Bridge were not theatrical displays of force. That bridge carries the coastal rail line linking Odessa to the Romanian border. Its neutralization sent a clear strategic message: isolate the region and make large-scale military resupply impractical. As these strikes accumulated over time, the resilience of Ukraine's coastal logistics network eroded. What had once functioned as a defensive zone gradually turned into a logistical burden. Each additional unit deployed to the area placed further strain on an already weakened supply chain. The ports of Odessa, while largely intact in physical terms, were rendered functionally ineffective for high-volume military operations. Without reliable road and rail access, they could no longer sustain prolonged defense or support significant offensive activity. At sea, the balance shifted just as decisively. In the early stages of the war, Ukrainian naval drones achieved notable tactical successes against Russian Black Sea Fleet assets. These operations demonstrated innovation and adaptability and forced Moscow to adjust its posture. However, they failed to dismantle the core of Russia's maritime strategy, which was area denial. The Black Sea Fleet adapted by operating from protected anchorages and reinforcing layered air defenses. More importantly, Russia expanded its long-range anti-ship and land attack missile envelope, increasing both reach and density. Over time, Moscow pushed Ukraine's controllable maritime space closer and closer to the coastline. This did not produce a visible blockade enforced by surface ships. Instead, it created something more effective: a risk-based blockade. Commercial shipping became economically unviable. Insurance premiums surged, routes were abandoned, and trade slowed before grinding to a halt. In practical terms, the Black Sea became a controlled fire zone under Russian dominance. The final layer of pressure came from land operations that completed the encirclement. Sustained Russian advances in the Eastern theater, particularly around key logistical corridors, forced Kyiv to commit its most capable formations to the Donbass. These experienced units became locked into attritional battles requiring constant reinforcement. This was the trap. By fixing Ukrainian attention, manpower, and resources in the east, Russia stripped the southern coastal sector of defensive depth. The Odessa-Mykolaiv axis was left under-resourced and unable to absorb sustained pressure. Any attempt to reinforce it risked collapse elsewhere along the front. This outcome was not the result of negligence or incompetence. It was the consequence of forced prioritization under extreme pressure. Moscow exploited this reality with precision. The corridor did not need to be physically seized, it only needed to be controlled. The strategic impact of this strangulation was immediate. Russia established local dominance in the northwestern Black Sea, and with it effective control over Ukraine's maritime access points. The corridor reshaped not only the military balance, but also the economic equation of the war. Moscow gained the ability to dictate commercial terms unilaterally, depriving Ukraine of a substantial share of its export revenue. Odessa shifted from an economic lifeline into a strategic liability, marking a clear inflection point in the conflict. From this point onward, analysis can no longer remain limited to battlefield mechanics alone. The opening of the Odessa Corridor is not simply a setback for Ukraine. It represents a direct challenge to NATO's credibility, its strategic judgment, and its deterrence model. Viewed through the lens of strategic realism, this was not an isolated tactical loss, but confirmation that Russia's attritional approach is working and a serious indictment of Western failure to prevent it. At the center of that failure lies a flawed assumption that shaped alliance policy from the very beginning. From the outset, NATO leaders spoke confidently about eventual victory while, in practice, implementing a carefully managed containment strategy. The objective was to support Ukraine without triggering a wider confrontation. That balance, however, came at a cost. Weapons deliveries were gradual, limited in scale, and often arrived too late to shape decisive outcomes. What emerged instead was a prolonged war of attrition, and wars of attrition favor the side with greater industrial capacity, manpower reserves, and logistical endurance. In this case, that side was Russia. While Moscow reorganized its economy to sustain long-term military production, increasing output of artillery, drones, glide bombs, and missiles, NATO's industrial base remained largely configured for peacetime conditions. Western support relied heavily on advanced and expensive systems delivered in relatively small numbers. These systems were impressive technologically, but they lacked the volume and persistence needed to counter sustained pressure. Bureaucratic delays, political hesitation, and high costs constrained both the speed and scale of assistance. Russia followed the opposite model. It emphasized mass, endurance, and cost efficiency. In the coastal campaign, this imbalance proved decisive. Sustained Russian pressure produced a slow but relentless logistical paralysis. Ukraine could not repair infrastructure as quickly as it was destroyed, and NATO could not replenish defensive systems fast enough to reverse the trend. Over time, this imbalance reshaped the entire threat environment confronting the alliance. What had initially been framed as a regional conflict confined to Ukraine evolved into a direct strategic challenge to NATO's southeastern flank. Romania and Bulgaria, both alliance members, now face a maritime boundary dominated by Russia. The Black Sea has ceased to function as a buffer zone. It has become an advanced arena of strategic competition in which Moscow holds a clear positional advantage. The implications for deterrence are serious. Deterrence does not rest on statements or symbolic red lines. It depends on demonstrated capability and the willingness to enforce them. When those lines shift repeatedly without decisive response, credibility erodes. Moscow has observed this pattern throughout the war and acted accordingly. The opening of the Odessa Corridor confirms that the West was either unwilling or unable to commit the resources necessary to block a critical strategic objective for the Kremlin. This outcome reinforces a belief deeply rooted in Russian historical experience that patience and strategic endurance ultimately yield results. It validates a doctrine built on industrial mobilization, long-term planning, and the assumption that democratic political systems struggle to sustain prolonged high-intensity conflict. For NATO, the immediate consequence is growing strategic fatigue. Years of political, economic, and military investment have culminated in the loss of Ukraine's most vital economic asset. Attention now shifts to what comes next. The corridor is not an endpoint. It is a platform from which Russia retains the initiative and opens a range of credible escalation paths. The alliance faces mounting pressure to respond not only to contain Russia, but to restore its own credibility. Yet every meaningful response carries risk. The Black Sea is no longer a peripheral theater. It has become a central arena of direct competition with consequences extending far beyond Ukraine. Energy flows, global food security, alliance cohesion, and the future of Western deterrence are now tied directly to what happens in this maritime space. The strategic approach that guided NATO policy up to this moment collapsed on two interconnected levels. The first was strategic focus. The alliance became almost entirely fixated on the land war in eastern Ukraine while treating the maritime and economic dimensions of the conflict as secondary. Control of the Black Sea was underestimated, even though it represented the decisive pressure point. By allowing Russia to steadily degrade coastal infrastructure and Ukrainian supply routes with relative impunity, NATO effectively created the conditions that made the opening of the Odessa Corridor possible. Long-range strikes that destroyed rail connections, bridges, and port logistics nodes continued because the defensive systems capable of stopping them were never deployed in sufficient numbers or in the right locations. Advanced air defense systems were announced repeatedly, but deliveries were slow, fragmented, and often disconnected from operational needs. In many cases, they were assigned to protect individual cities rather than entire operational theaters. The southern coastline remained exposed not due to a single tactical error, but because of deliberate strategic prioritization. The second level of failure was industrial, and it proved just as damaging. Modern warfare at this scale is decided as much in factories, supply chains, and production timelines as it is on the battlefield. Russia adapted its economy to sustain continuous military output, while Western industry remained constrained by cost structures, regulatory barriers, and political caution. As Russian pressure persisted, its effects accumulated. Infrastructure degradation consistently outpaced repair efforts, and defensive capabilities eroded faster than they could be replaced. This slow but steady imbalance reshaped the strategic reality in the Black Sea and forced NATO to confront an uncomfortable conclusion. The alliance had suffered a strategic defeat and now faced a choice about how far it was willing to go to challenge it. The opening of the Odessa Corridor marked the start of a far more volatile phase of the conflict, one that demanded a reassessment of assumptions that no longer held. The strategic environment has changed in ways that cannot simply be reversed. With that shift comes a set of scenarios that are no longer theoretical, but increasingly plausible. The central question is no longer whether the situation in the Black Sea is contained, but how far Moscow is prepared to press its advantage and how the West will respond under rising political and strategic pressure. The most likely outcome is also the least dramatic on the surface. Russia consolidates control over the corridor without launching a costly and destructive urban assault on Odessa itself. By maintaining maritime dominance and sustained air superiority over surrounding ports, Moscow can achieve most of its objectives without engaging in prolonged street fighting. In this scenario, Odessa may remain formally under Ukrainian control, but its economic role would be effectively neutralized. Ukraine's maritime economy would be absorbed quietly, not through annexation, but through operational control. Commercial activity would become impossible without Russian consent. The flow of grain, steel, and shipping would be subject to regulation, delay, or outright denial. What emerges is a frozen phase of the conflict, not defined by ceasefire lines on land, but by control of access to the sea. Ukraine may retain territory, but it loses economic autonomy and strategic flexibility. This outcome would allow Moscow to secure decisive leverage at relatively low cost. With its coastal flank stabilized, Russian focus could then shift westward. The long-discussed objective of establishing a connection to Transnistria becomes operationally feasible from a secure southern perimeter. Creating a land link to the pro-Russian enclave in Moldova would carry comparatively limited military risk under these conditions. The implications would be severe. Moldova's sovereignty would be directly challenged, and the conflict would move dangerously closer to NATO's borders. Romania, an alliance member, would suddenly face a Russian-controlled corridor along its frontier. This would sharply reduce regional strategic depth and intensify pressure on NATO's decision-making processes, particularly regarding response times and the credibility of collective defense commitments. The most dangerous scenario lies in a rushed attempt to reverse the corridor by force. Under mounting domestic political pressure, NATO could be tempted to deploy naval assets or advanced air defense systems directly into the Odessa region. The stated objective would be to secure commercial shipping and restore maritime access. In practice, such a move would carry an extremely high risk of direct confrontation. The Black Sea would become an active friction zone. Russian long-range missile systems would target Western deployments, while NATO air defenses would be forced into live